Welcome to What's the Story Dublin, the official Dublin City Council podcast with me, your host, Deirdre Malumbi. This podcast deep dives into the work of all the moving parts that make up Dublin City Council. It also shares news of the Council's latest initiatives and exciting events. Today, we're looking at Dublin City Council's Biodiversity Artist in Residence. We'll be speaking both with Haugh, who is the current Biodiversity Artist in Residence, and Ruth Carroll, who is Curator and Project Manager. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Deirdre, thank you so much for having us on.
Of course. I was wondering if, first of all, Ruth, can you tell us a bit about your current role, as we ask all our podcast guests? And can you also tell us a bit about how you became involved with the Biodiversity Artist in Residency programme?
I think we'll probably start off with a little bit about me. I'm a curator. I've always worked within large organisations. I went out on my own as a freelance curator, project manager and cultural producer about 2 years ago. And from I knew the project was kind of coming up, and I had a conversation with Ray Yates, and then made an application to do this job, and I find myself now sitting here almost 2 years into this project. But the project itself kind of came around was a conversation that happened with Sabrina Dekker, who is now heading up the CARO within the council, and Ray Yates, who's the arts officer, and they kind of were thinking about, well, what would happen if we placed an artist within the council, and if we embedded those artistic practices in, what would be the outcome? How would it work? What would it look like? And then an opportunity came up through Creative Ireland. So Creative Ireland had this new scheme that came out about 2.5 years ago now, which was funding projects that were ostensibly about climate action and looking at creativity around climate action. And basically, so Creative Ireland came in as major funder on this. And from that, we put in place this residency and to see what would it look like. And from that, we find ourselves now almost at the end of this residency and kind of looking at outcomes and the legacy of it. But it's been a really extraordinary, interesting place to work in terms of the resources that the council has, and in terms of the resources that have the artists been offered in terms of research and just looking at, ideas of places of interest, and how open everyone has been to speaking with artists and engaging with the project on very, very different levels.
Brilliant. Can you tell us a bit, Ruth, about how does for people who are unfamiliar even with the term, residency, it works? So how does this particular residency work? How long does it last?
Okay, so we brought in 3 different artists that have very, very different artistic practices, and they each had a period of 6 months in council. And this residency works very different from another artist residency. Generally, artist residencies would be an artist would be given a space to work, a space to create, to compose, to write with a stipend, and it would be there would be for a certain period of time. This works really differently, because what we thought would be more interesting is what happens if you bring an artist into an organisation and really embed them within that and kind of see what happens. We didn't know what was going to happen at the start of the residency. So it was a lot of kind of testing things, see how the organisation would be and how open it would be to, engaging with an artist on a very, very different level. These artists are very much, they do some make theatre, some make research, the outcomes are very, very different. So they're not artists that needed a space to paint or to make print or sculpt or any of those sort of different things. So what the opportunity was to ask questions from all those areas of interest. And there were so many areas of interest that these artists have in terms of the work that the council does. But ostensibly what this residency was about how do we talk about biodiversity and nature within the organisation. It wasn't a citywide project, because obviously with the resources that we would need for that would be infinite. But it was really how do we talk about nature and biodiversity within the organisation itself, and how do we look at artistic practice as a way of looking at these problems and maybe solving it, but also just looking and interrogating how the council holds nature. And where is that nature? How is it held? How is it respected? How do we create more spaces for nature? So it was a lot of those questions we started off, I didn't know any of these. So a lot of what's been really brilliant about this residency is how open everyone has been to, answering all the questions that I have, and I have many, about, how things work and all those different things. And I think ostensibly it's just been very interesting to have creative practice within somewhere where there generally isn't creative practice. And there's been a lot of raised eyebrows, but I think we like that.
Absolutely. No, it's really kind of worked in terms of that experimentation. And it's interesting that you say even about the spaces and how it's different to other artists in residency who kind of have an assigned space. Because I suppose by the very nature of biodiversity and nature, that wouldn't really make sense to kind of put someone in a room or put someone in a studio.
It's kind of but I think what it is, it's it was very important for me when this started was that we would have access to everyone who works in different departments. Mm-hmm. So the only reason we can do that is by sitting in Block 1, Floor 6. We were basically based in the climate action team. Yeah. So I'm using everyone around us to basically go, I need to talk to someone who works for flooding, but I need someone in a certain level. Can you help me? Who would be able to help us? Who would be able to answer this question? So people have been extraordinarily helpful in terms of the project with the 3 artists. So it's been a real interesting learning, but I've never sat in a cubicle before. So it's and especially for the artists. So we're in that office environment and working in a very kind of different way, in a very non-linear way. And it's very interesting to bring something in that is very, I always say artistic practice is quite malleable. It's quite watery. It's very fluid into something that is ostensibly very structured. And I think that's where the interesting conversations have come.
Absolutely. It sounds fascinating that it's kind of been able to integrate that sense of spontaneity, I suppose. Yeah. You actually already touched on it, and I was curious if we could talk a little bit about the kind of previous artists in the Biodiversity Artist in Residency programme. Obviously, we'll be speaking with Louis as well about who's our current Biodiversity Artist in Residence. But just out of curiosity, what were kind of the backgrounds of those past artists? What kind of projects did they pursue in the residency, and what were they bringing into this kind of collaborative process that you mentioned?
Well, we had 3 artists, and as I said, we're coming to the end now of the third artist's time. Our first artist was Rosie O'Reilly, who's an artist and artist researcher. Second artist was Luke Casserly, who's a performance maker and also researcher, and then Louis, who we're speaking to today. What was interesting was, someone like Rosie O'Reilly, who's already began working in the area of nature biodiversity. What she found was very, I hate to put words in people's mouths, but what we were looking at was basically rivers and water and the water systems. So obviously you have all these experts within the council, and Rosie had all these people that we could contact and speak to. And what came out of that was 2 or 3 really interesting outcomes. We never designed this residency to have a tangible thing. It was always about the conversation. It was about how do we talk about nature? How do we use artistic practice and artistic thinking to bring solutions to nature and the biodiversity crisis and climate action? But what happened is, it's when the artists came in, they're like, well, actually, I want to do this. So we had the resources and the time to be able to make these really interesting kind of interventions. So what Rosie O'Reilly did, her project was called Owen, which obviously is River Oscuelga. And she began we put a call out for stories about rivers. And from that, we made an app which is available through the Dublin Trails called Owen, which is 7 very distinct episodes, which are around these 7 key areas of water and Liffey. And it talks about history, and it talks about especially social history, talks about nature, talks about biodiversity, but also talks about the work that the council do in terms of how, river upkeep, and a lot about kind of how a lot of the rivers now are culverted, how they've become part of the drainage system, just through 800, 900 years of just, human intervention. And for me, that's been a very, very interesting kind of a very interesting outcome. So, that app is there. Rosie also has an analog version, which is available to borrow from the artist. And so there's a website as well, which is, I think it's owen.ie. The next artist we had was Luke Casserly, who is a theatre maker. And he's come from very interesting. We always talk about, being from Dublin and not from Dublin. I'm not from Dublin myself. Luke is from Offaly. So it's bringing that idea of transplant and, how do you understand when nature is all around you as you grow up? How do you understand nature when you come to an urban environment? And we also talk about Dublin City and Dublin City Council as being, the most urban of all the local authority areas. So it's like looking at how we kind of talk about nature. So Luke started researching. He's really interesting practice. He's got this beautiful piece that he tours called Distillation. So, and that's about bog and, how our, relationship to it. And it's very sort of multi-sensory kind of way of looking at it. So, and this is how, talking about nature kind of works when you bring in artistic practice, because it comes very much about all the different senses. So rather than just seeing it as, an intellectual problem, if you can feel something and you can talk about something on a very different level, there's a different understanding of it. So what Luke did was he did these really beautiful walks and he invited people from within the council from different departments to meet him at lunch and to walk and see how all these small little interventions of looking at nature in different ways. And that was like looking at, things that pop up through pavements. That's considered a weed, but as we all say, a weed is just a flower out of place. And the conversations that happened with that, he started looking at it and this word invasive species kept coming up. So we finished and all the research, and he rewrote all this research in this really powerful theatre piece that was then performed to all the people that took part in these walks. And also what's come out of that is this very interesting publication. So it's photographs from Luke's time with us here, and also texts and recipes that a lot of different collaborators have made about looking at invasive species as an ingredient for something, which is a very interesting way of looking at it. So it's kind of reframing something as, it's like, so rather than something that's kind of, to be removed or to be whatever, it's like maybe we can reframe it and find a different use for all of these different things that, that have, sort of like we look at throughout the city. And that's been a very interesting way. And also just that idea of reframing something that is considered to have no use that actually may have a different use as well.
Absolutely. No, they're really exciting outcomes for those residencies. Actually, we kind of touched on it there, but what are your own kind of general thoughts and reflections when you think of biodiversity in Dublin City?
I've always been told by people who work in nature preservation is never to use the word biodiversity. And I think that was probably, a bit of a mistake when we started. And it was only from talking to people and going, well, what does biodiversity mean to you? And it means so many different things to so many different people. And it's just, it's so interesting because when we speak to people, and I think that's been what the most important thing of the project has been, is like being those one-to-one engagements, talking to people and going, okay, so you work in traffic. Do you ever think about, is the biodiversity part of your job? And it's like, no. And then the more we interrogate it, we realise that it can be, and it is. And it's what it's looking at is, as well, is like bringing people together and realising that it's only by community and collective action that we'll be able to have an effect on addressing the crisis that we've all find ourselves in. And it's not just Dublin City. It's across the country that, if you look at, numbers of insects are completely down on 10 years ago. It's looking at, well, how do we create a space for nature? Because nature, and also looking at nature, that it's not something that's separate from us. It is something that we're all part of. And without nature and pollinators and all those sort of things, we just won't be able to survive. So it's kind of looking at that in a different way, but in a way that's hopeful. And I think that's a really important thing when you're talking about climate action, is that you have to have that idea is that, there is opportunity here. Be hopeful about what we can do. Small actions create really, really large things. And there's been a real openness from anyone that we speak to about biodiversity and nature within a city, that everyone's like realising, it's like going, oh, actually, that is a small thing that I can do. And this is a small thing I can talk about. And I think it's about those conversations that create these sort of almost like Chinese whispers that have been very interesting. So, people that were involved, say, in Rosie's initial project have been involved in a lot of, Luke's project, and then on to Louis as well. So we're building this really interesting, almost like community just through all these different interventions that we've been working on. And I think that's been a really interesting part of it. So by the end of it, what we're going to look at is these three very diverse ways of talking about nature. And, with these very different outcomes. I know Louis has spoken about what he's going to make, was a really exciting project. Then Luke's project is, we're going to share that citywide, that publication, because, downloadable PDF, which makes a lot of sense in terms of sort of sustainability, rather than, we'd love you to print one for everyone in the council, but let's not do that. So it'll be available to download, and we'll have that on the Dublin City website as well. But what it is as well, I think it's about what happens when you bring artistic thinking into somewhere and you try to find solutions. And it is those really small conversations that are the catalyst to something bigger.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all that, Ruth. I suppose my very last question for you is, what's kind of the future of the Biodiversity Artist in Residency programme, or is it kind of morphing into something else now, or what can we expect next?
I don't know. Basically, we have been, as I said, the funding has been through Creative Ireland, which the project will be finishing in sort of October, November, and the project will be finished. So, I mean, it would be nice to look at possibly doing something else, maybe looking at a different sort of climate activation, maybe bringing in other artists in, because for me it's been like absolutely amazing to work at, and to work with these really talented artists, and to work within the council. And there's been just some extraordinary conversations, and really great people who've been so helpful. But essentially the way we're looking at it now is, the project will be finishing, so we may look at seeing if we can get funding for something else, but again, that's not confirmed. But it'd be lovely to, ostensibly, what I think as a curator, it'd be really brilliant to have an artist in residence in all large organisations, and just to ask those questions that sometimes don't get asked.
Absolutely. And I think with all the work from those artists and their amazing output, it's definitely going to take some form in the future, and we're really excited to see that. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Deirdre.
So Louis, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Delighted to be here.
I was wondering if, first of all, you could tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I'm a visual artist based in Dublin. I live in Rialto, originally from Blanchardstown, so Fingal kind of side of town. And yeah, I guess I've always been interested, or had an interest and a curiosity in how things work and how things fit together, how things are made, an interest in the natural world, the outside world. So I didn't know when I was a kid that could translate into being an artist, but I guess I've always been on this path of kind of curiosity and exploration. So yeah, I've always had an interest in the natural world, and I guess my place within it. And really, I guess my practice is a way for me to make sense of that, and to give me a framework to be curious, and to make work, and to research, to work with other people, to basically just exist in the world in a way that I feel is meaningful and worthwhile. My background artistically is in photography. I studied photography. I have a degree in photography. And I also have worked for more than a decade as a freelance museum photographer. So I've spent a lot of time taking photographs of other people's work, of art events, of archives, exhibitions, mostly contemporary art. But I guess that's given me a very particular way that I see or experience the art world, through, no pun intended, but through a very particular lens. And even though sometimes the work I make now as an artist isn't necessarily rooted in photography, or the output isn't photography, thinking about the world, or thinking about how to approach something photographically is usually how I approach new projects or commissions.
Absolutely. And can you tell us a bit about what was the experience that kind of led you to this specific residency as Biodiversity Artist in Residence?
Sure. I'm still getting my head around that mouthful. But I guess looking back, when I was a younger artist or just coming out of photography school, I had a very particular image of what it meant to be an artist, or what it is to be an artist, or what an artist does all day, professionally. And over the last, what am I now, 36, over the last, 12, 14 years of living and working in Dublin, I guess that idea has changed quite dramatically. I remember when I was 19 or 20, imagining a future as an artist in Dublin, and I was imagining that I would have, museum shows, and have gallery representation, and I'd be flying off and doing these, Paris photo and all of these kind of art events around the world. And for sure, that is a sustainable career for some people, a very small number of people. But there's many other ways to be an artist. And as I was photographing other people's practices, other people's work, other people's research, I started to piece together what was possible for me, and really what was interesting for me as well. I love working with other people. I love learning from other people. And I slowly started to build up a collaborative arts practice. We're quite lucky in Ireland in that there's a lot of opportunities, kind of small commissions, small community projects around social engagement and community engagement. And it's always been really important to me to work with other people across other spectrums of society and professions. So yeah, slowly but surely, I guess I just started chipping away at different projects. My first one was quite a long time ago now. It was a Grange Gorman Development Agency, maybe phase 2 commission. And I worked with a community in Stoneybatter on a knitting project. So I met every Tuesday with the knitting club in Stoneybatter, and we would knit and chat. And that became a walking tour of Stoneybatter that you could download on your phone. And the tour was led by the voices of older residents. And then kind of one project after another project, from community to community, from different collaborative overlaps to another, I started working with a more keener focus on the environment and the natural world, and started researching the history of forestry in Ireland, the kind of origins of the Sitka spruce, which is the tree that has the lion's share of forestry in Ireland. More than 70% of trees in Ireland are Sitka spruce. So just being curious about that kind of historical relationship between a forest or a tree and the land, and kind of asking those questions about, like, what does that mean for me living today as a person in the world, having this kind of historical perspective. So I was also the Biodiversity Artist in Residence for Fingal County Council before this residency. I was also invited to participate in an arts and education project in Portmarnock led by Anne Bradley. And that was another opportunity for me to really kind of pick apart what it meant to be an artist and kind of put it back together in a different way. And over the years, I then started working with schools and children in Dublin city centre, and creating opportunities for them to think creatively about the environment that they live in and ask questions about trees and land use and forestry and kind of big questions about right to belong or exist or provenance. So I guess all of those kind of projects accumulatively led to me working now on this biodiversity residency with the council.
Brilliant, brilliant. It sounds like you come from like a vast range of kind of experience when it comes to the arts and working with the community and everything. I was wondering if you could share with us maybe some of your thoughts on biodiversity in Dublin City specifically, and is there anything that kind of makes, Dublin City's biodiversity distinct from, say, other areas or...
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and not to pick it apart from like an analytical kind of level, but I find it interesting the way people talk about biodiversity being separate. So I see biodiversity as being this one big thing across vast amounts of space, and to imagine biodiversity having borders that fit within, let's say, Dublin City or Dublin City Council or local authorities, I find that kind of an interesting assumption or take. That's not to say that what exists within the council isn't different from what exists outside of it. And sorry, when I say the council, I mean like Dublin City council area. It is very much different. So the type of biodiversity and ecology that we observe in city centres or urban environments is of course going to be very different to more rural or remote locations. I think people are very unaware of what exists within Dublin as, you know, a place of ecology. The Liffey and the Dublin Bay biosphere, for example, I am not the person to talk about that because it's insane what exists there. The kind of plethora of fauna and flora and the kind of relationship between that and the city is just a really special thing. I recently went on the 10-year anniversary cruise of the Dublin Bay biosphere, led by Paula McGrain, who's part of the Parks Department. And just hearing, again, it speaks back to my interest in working with other people and experts, because there was just this whole panel of discussion, and there was this whole panel of speakers on the boat discussing all of these different aspects of biodiversity and ecology that just blew my mind. Like the old Irish goat herder on Dalkey Island and Haugh Head, for example, using this really old, kind of almost primitive, but also, you know, incredibly advanced way of dealing with like overgrown foliage and hedgerows, and bringing in this herd of goats, for example, to kind of manage that in a really sustainable way was just like, it blew my mind. The thing I will speak about though in the city centre is people's lack of understanding about what it actually takes to maintain biodiversity within an urban environment. I'm constantly hearing people who live and work in Dublin saying, oh, why don't they plant more native Irish trees in the city? Why do they plant that tree there? Why not an oak tree? And Ireland for sure has 18 native broadleaf trees. They're wonderful, beautiful trees. We all love them. Not one of them is suited to growing in city environments. So if you're planting a tree and your aim really for that tree is to live for as long as possible and not wreck a road or ruin a building, if your aim is to really plant that tree and care for it, and for that tree to sequester carbon, reduce pavement temperatures in summer, help with drainage. If you're really thinking about the mechanics of that tree, none of our native trees are suitable for those tasks. And we have to look outside of what's native to Ireland, and we have to start looking at what thrives in other changing climates. So I really feel like there's a breakdown in communication when we're talking about biodiversity within the city centre and what residents and inhabitants of Dublin expect that to look like. Absolutely.
That's all very true and all very insightful. And I was wondering if next, Louis, you could tell us about the project or projects you're pursuing currently through the residency. Are you looking at some of these things that you might have mentioned?
Yeah, so again, going back to my interest in working with other people and having a collaborative arts practice, I am inviting small groups of council staff to join me for 30-minute walkthroughs of the building. And that session is broken into two halves. And the first half of that session is really geared towards making a series of photographs. So what I'm asking people to do is imagine the scale of a particular tree. So Ludo Beaumont is the tree officer for the council, and he's given me a list of interesting trees that are growing within his care within Dublin City Council. So right across the administrative zone of the council, as far up as, let's say, St. Anne's Park, there's about 20 trees on the list, and he's given me, you know, the year it was planted, the height of it, the circumference, and a few other interesting facts. And I'm asking small groups of council staff of between maybe 2 or 3 people to imagine the scale of that tree somewhere within the council building. And it's really just a way to get people to think slightly differently about the outside world, let's say, inside, and give them an opportunity to imagine a type of scale that they're probably not used to imagining. So even if you're an architect or you have some sort of design role within the council, you're probably not used to imagining trees growing within buildings. It's usually like an outside thing. So it's a little bit of fun. I like to incorporate play and kind of games into that initial research phase. But really what we're doing is we're using a colourful ribbon to imagine the scale of that tree. And then I'm asking that group of people to position that somewhere in the council. And I'm going to return at a later date and make a formal photograph of that. So that's going to be a series of collaboratively generated images, let's say, coming out of that research phase that can exist as, a series of photographs beyond the residency. The second half of the workshop is asking people to respond to a series of words. And I'm not going to give too much away because there is a bit of a reveal during that process, and I'm still in that process. But it speaks to my interest into how language can shape or influence our relationship to something. So I'm really kind of teasing out that kind of linguistic relationship to certain words and trying to figure out how our gut instinct or kind of initial kind of feeling towards a word can actually change our relationship to a bigger thing.
Brilliant. It all sounds fascinating, and I love the idea of like incorporating the imagination into it, because I'm like quite a creative and imaginative person myself. I like to think anyway. But what stage are you at now in terms of the project? You mentioned those two phases. Are they kind of happening together or one at a time? So I suppose I was wondering, what stage are you at now and what's kind of coming next?
So I'm in the middle of that research phase. I've met with about 20, 25 individuals. I'm hoping to meet with maybe another 15. I'm also chatting to a designer who is designing several kind of outputs for the project. And the great thing about that is Stina can start the design process before I have all of the content. So it is a bit of a tight turnaround. The residency finishes at the end of September. I need to basically have everything finished from my side and also from the production side. So the final output of the second half of that workshop that I spoke about is going to be a series of flags flying along the River Liffey for the first 2 weeks of October.
Oh, lovely.
So we're kind of tied up in the production timeline of that process, which is completely new to me. I've never made a flag before, but they are going to be really large scale works. They're 12 by 6 foot a piece, and we're going to have about 30 of them flying north and south of the Liffey in front of the council building on Wood Quay.
That sounds so exciting. I'm really looking forward to seeing all that. I just have this image in my mind. Oh, so beautiful. And what kind of impacts do you think this project is going to have, maybe in relation to your career within Dublin City Council, those kind of long-term effects, I suppose?
So what I'm really interested in is creating these opportunities for people to have conversations around the environment that actually have a lot of meaning behind them. I think a lot of people feel quite paralysed or helpless in the face of climate change and ecosystem collapse. But actually, it's very easy to have a meaningful impact on local ecosystems. And I think when you lead a project like this, and the crux of it is these small 30-minute interactions that end up having this really big output, I think it's a nice reminder for people that these small, brief conversations actually have quite a lot of meaning behind them. I think people are obsessed with saving the world and fixing climate change, and they say my plastic straws aren't going to do anything when X, Y and Z is flying a jet across the world. For sure, I get that. But actually, by reducing plastic pollution in your local ecosystem, which could be your front garden or a pavement in Dublin City Council, it's not the global ecosystem, it's the local ecosystem. You're preventing a bird from choking on a bit of plastic, a little hedgehog from getting wrapped up in fishing wire, for example. So I think we need to remember that our actions on a daily basis can have really big impacts, but on a much smaller scale. So with the work that I'm making, it's kind of a reminder to everybody that was involved that these small things, these small actions, this, decision to respond to an email about biodiversity can actually have this like really big knock-on effect. And yeah, I would just hope that when the flags go up in October, people feel kind of proud to have been involved in that research phase.
Thank you so much for that, Louis. Some really fascinating information there and insights. No doubt we're going to see your name again.
For sure. Thanks so much for having me on.
And thanks again to today's guests, Louis and Ruth. I'd also like to extend my thanks to our audio engineer and editor, Robert Fay. This podcast was produced by myself, Deirdre Malumbi, and Michael Ryan, and recorded in the Central Library Studio. Be sure to spread the word if you're enjoying What's the Story Dublin, and to like and subscribe for future episodes. Slán go fóill.